Hey everyone, welcome to another DevOps Unbound live roundtable edition. I'm your co-host, Alan Schimmel, CEO of Techstrong Group, and welcome. For those of you who have not been on one of these before, DevOps Unbound is a semi-weekly, actually bi-weekly video series. So that means every other week. We do a episode of DevOps Unbound, and we explore just different areas of interest within DevOps, exploring some of the dark nooks and crannies that make up the ever expanding, it seems, DevOps world. Every 2 to 3 shows, however, we do a special edition like this of DevOps Unbound, where we ask you, our audience, to join in, and not only to join in, but to help drive the show, right? We have a great panel lined up for you here today. But what we talk about, to a large extent, will be driven by you in the audience, by your questions, your comments, and so forth. I'm going to go over with you how to interact with our panel in just a moment, as well as today's topic. But before we do that, just a couple of things. Number one, big thanks to our friends at Tricentis, who are the sponsors of DevOps Unbound and have been for 2 years now. We couldn't do this show without them. And they are, as I always say, one of the best partners to work with. So many thanks to our friends at Tricentis. Secondly, these shows are really dependent on the quality of our panels. And we are blessed to always get great people on our panels. No different today. We have a fantastic panel. I want to introduce you to all of them right now, and then we'll move ahead. Let me start off with a semi-regular here on DevOps Unbound, Adam Arkalian. If I mispronounce, I apologize.
You got it,
Adam.
Alan.
All right. Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience, Adam?
Sure. So I'm Adam Arkalian. I work at a small company called Dell. Some of you might have heard of it. I'm a senior director there, and I work in their infrastructure server group, running a DevOps group. And very excited to be here to talk to you all about open source and how we handle open source and how we can test open source and reduce those testing silos. Alan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. Pleasure. Next up, she's a first-time guest as a panel member here. Paloma Oliveira. If I mispronounce, I apologize. Why don't you help me?
Was perfect.
Okay.
Thank you all for the invitation. It is a great pleasure to be here. I am a developer advocate at Sauce Labs, and I am focused on open source communities, which I've been inside and contributing in several ways for like a decade now. And I'm very passionate about the subject, so I'm enjoying a lot this panel. Excellent.
Next up, I want to introduce, and I don't want to mess up his last name, but it's Andreas. Andreas, help me with your last name.
Potvin.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a German last name. Actually French, but later German.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Andreas, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on the show, Alan. I am coming from the Tricentis side. I'm a solutions architect with Tricentis. Been with the company for about 4 years, primarily focusing on test management and functional test automation. And I'm excited to be here to talk about these topics.
Excellent. Excellent. And then our next, or our fourth panelist, right, is Talia, and I don't want to mess up your last name either, Talia. I apologize. How do you pronounce it?
Talia Nasi.
Nasi. Talia, why don't you give us a little bit of your background?
Yeah, so I'm a lead developer advocate for Akamai, and I work on both Akamai and Linode and kind of the integration of the two services. Previously I was at AWS as a developer advocate on the serverless team. And before that, I was a test engineer, so I come from a testing background.
Excellent. What a great panel. Last but not least is my co-host, of DevOps Unbound. He's also CTO here at Techstrong Group. My friend Mitch Ashley. Mitch, why don't you give him your background?
Well, I'm also an analyst with Techstrong Research, and I go way back as a software developer and running product development teams, both on commercial products and also IT organizations. So a lot of time with test teams and appreciate the extreme skill and value that they bring. And open source, our topic today. So I'll let you talk about that. But by the way, I'm your Ed McMahon to your Johnny Carson. So,
Mitch, you're dating us.
Totally am.
Okay. So, guys, before I jump into the topic for today, I just want to, first of all, thank our audience. And I see some of you have already logged on and said hello and where you're from. And that's always, ever since I first started getting on the internet in the mid-90s, it's always been something that kind of gets me going, is you see that there's people from all over the world, right? The internet knows no borders, and it's no different today. We have people from Berlin and Brazil and New York and here in Florida, Colorado, and elsewhere. So feel free to just log on in that chat window. We call it our communications window. It's on the right side of the browser for most of you. And you'll see under chat public, you can type away in there and it'll show up. But more than just telling us where you're from, it offers a key way for folks to interact and ask the panelists any questions you may have. So feel free to do that. And as we get jumping into our topic today, that is a primary way for you to talk. Now, when you put it in public chat like that, other people may answer your question in chat. Maybe some of the panelists do. Maybe other, people who have logged on today. Anyone can answer and talk in the chat session. So you're free to use that. If there's a question specifically for the panel, though, that you'd like us to, kind of raise up to the level of the panel, come to the Q&A section of your communications window. So that's right to the right of where it says chat. And anything you type in there will show up, not for everyone logged in, but just here for the panel members. And we'll raise that up here and try to answer your questions. So that's just a quick word on how to interact with us today. And we love the interaction, so don't be shy. Today's topic, it's a great topic, right? It's open sourcery. Vanquish your open source testing silos in the magical world of open source. Yeah, it sounds a little Game of Thrones or Wizards and Warlocks, but I started DevOps.com about 8 or 9 years ago now. And I think one of the big success stories and also one of the big enablers of DevOps and DevOps success has been automated open source testing. There were a lot of doomsayers when DevOps first started becoming popular, that it would signal the end of QA as we know it. It would signal the end of the tester, the professional tester. And nothing could be farther from the truth. We see testing has flourished like never before in all of its many different flavors and use cases. But certainly open source testing tools like a Selenium, for instance, have enabled testing to really just claim its rightful spot in the development life cycle, right? It's no longer a thing we dread that we don't have budget or time for. Well, maybe we still do, but I'll let you guys decide. But it's something that is now just so much more built in, and so the automation and the breadth of open source tools that we have in testing has allowed us to do so many different things. One may question, though, is it a victim of its own success, right? Have we done so much, automation and have so many open source tools that we kind of take it for granted, or we're not innovating, or it's not living up to its promise? Andreas, you're with Tricentis, a testing company. So I'm gonna put the onus on you to kick us off on this topic, and then ask the panel. Feel free to jump in.
Sure, I can speak from my experience interacting with several customers out there who are adopting open source technologies or are in the process of it. Some of them are in this journey, right? Because the way I see it is that automation is a journey in itself. It's very hard for a company to say, from this point on, we're only going to do automation, or we're only going to be agile, only DevOps. As there's a lot of moving pieces into that process that we really have to put together to really get there. But really, I think one of the main benefits of automation in the past few years is that it's allowed us to scale, right? Back in the day when we were doing a lot of development in waterfall methodologies, there was a lot of manual testing. That used to be fine for the time, but now that our entire business runs digitally, now that we need several applications that we're constantly iterating on, and our processes are much faster, Agile and DevOps move very quickly, and we need to be able to keep up with that pace. So really, open source automation comes very in handy when we're trying to achieve that level of scale. I think that it was interesting, though, what you mentioned, that is automation a victim of its own success? And whether it's we were using it to find an answer to this challenge of scale and being able to keep up with our speed. But as we do so, and as we add automation, we do introduce a certain level of complexity, right? Now we need to have users that are familiar with the automation, and now we also have to manage that automation, which becomes a whole process in and of itself. So I think it's worth maybe exploring that journey and what it really takes you to get there, to really take full advantage of the automation, and so it doesn't become a burden to your organization, right? We don't want automation to add more problems that we had before. We want it to make us leaner, faster, more agile, and that's really when enforcing that process and making sure that we're adopting automation and open source frameworks the correct way. It's very important, and we see it all the time with the customers that we work with.
Panel?
Yeah, if I may, Adam?
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I find it quite interesting because hearing you speak, I actually relate a little bit with the history of Sauce Labs. That was one of the, I don't know, the first per se, but we were in the starting of talking about testing automation, and comparing the history of just the company I work for with the history of testing. I'm not sure if it is what I see. It's interestingly a little bit a development together with the technology itself and the process of technology. And nowadays, if we understand the importance of software in human lives, and this is for me what is the main point of technology, right? Like, it's supposed to exist to make our lives better, but with people using it in a very frustrating way, if we don't have ways to test it during the tool chain, in the production, before the production, after, while in use, and therefore using this idea of DevOps applied to testing itself, it makes it very difficult to use software in a reliable way. And not sure if it makes sense. It was a lot of in my head condensed in a short phrase. But maybe what I wanted to say is that I don't see that's the end at all of testing. I think it's being totally implemented and into the whole process of the software development, not just in the beginning, in the idea, but it's supposed to go along with. And of course, automation help us to save a lot of time and massive work. But you are totally right that if one day we thought, oh, the robots will steal our works, it's not about that, but about being kind of organically working with and using the manual testers to do some part of the work, but using the power of automation to make it more reliable to the end user, to the ones that will use it.
Adam, I think you had something to say.
Yeah. So what I was going to say, and both Andres and Paloma make great points. What I was going to add on to that was, there are so many. There's a vast array of open source testing tools that it's easy to fall into silos, especially when you think about the scalability of enterprise or larger organizations. You know, Group A, Group B, Group C, Group D, et cetera. Group N won't talk to each other, right? So what's to prevent them from pulling down an open source testing framework, and have those open source testing frameworks all be different across the board, right? And so one of the things that I think is critically important is laying out consistency in what we're using from an open source testing framework, identifying clear purposes for them, and then creating ecosystems around them so that we have a validity of, or I should say, we have a level of expertise in these open source testing frameworks. So we go from, you know, vast to scoped. We build up a level of expertise in the frameworks themselves, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have subject matter experts in the products themselves that we're testing. And you'll always need subject matter experts, regardless of how much automation you put in there. I mean, at the end of the day, we can add all the automation we want, but are we testing the right things in response to the product, and getting back the right responses? So along with that, along with the points that Andres and Paloma were making, you know, it comes down to scope. It comes down to ecosystems, and we still need that subject matter expertise in the products to actually drive effective testing.
Agreed.
One of the things I always talk about when I do talks about testing is what to test, and this ties into what you were saying, Adam, about how do you know like which tests to write. The two places I always tell people to look, the first is with the product person, and just figure out like what are the most business critical product flows that, like, if this breaks, you know, your entire business is going to crash. Like, these are the important business flows that we need to have a business. And then secondly, to look at data and see like what people are doing the most in your application. So if it's a checkout flow, or if it's a whatever your application is, like what are people clicking on the most? What are people doing the most? And I think between your data and your business needs, you have a really good idea of like what's important in your application to test.
Fair. So, you know, I look at it, you know, one of the missions of DevOps is busting silos, breaking down silos. And, you know, when you look at DevOps from 500,000 feet, one of the silos to break down is the testing silo. And the idea was, all right, we're going to move testing, you know, we're going to let developers do testing, where DevOps engineers will do testing. You know, we're not going to have just a silo of testing. But, you know, when you flew that plane down to just 50,000 feet instead of 500,000 feet, what you saw is that with testing itself wasn't a monolith. There were silos within testing, different kinds of tests. For whatever reason, some types of testing really relied heavily on open source tools, right? Open source tools became dominant. Selenium is a great example. In other kinds of testing, open source tools didn't really dominate. You know, it was still very much proprietary type of testing tools that were out there. Now, over time, though, I've seen a shift to all testing starting to rely on open source based tools, and then companies like a Tricentis or like a Sauce or what have you add functionality, features, value on top of that open source foundation. Is that the way it'll continue to go, you think? Do you think we'll see more and more open source tools dominating the marketplace with companies just adding value on top?
So I'd like to take that
Go
one,
ahead.
if you don't mind, at least start off with.
No, go.
So my perspective on that, it comes down to risk, right? And so when we step back and we go back in our time machine there for a little bit, and we think about open source and the conception of it, right? It was the whole notion around software should be free and we shouldn't pay for software, blah 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 blah. And when you begin to look at products that were creating intellectual property, that were selling software for profit, those two organizations began to clash, right? And so when a product that was building intellectual property started looking at open source, they said at high risk, why am I going to use that? I'd rather build my own thing. I don't know what's in there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? As we've evolved, though, we've become much more risk averse to a degree. And I wouldn't make a blanket statement that says, in the medical or financial institutions, they're not risk averse. There's different levels, but I would say in general, there's definitely more and more organizations are open to taking risk. And when they begin to think about, well, how can I accelerate my automation and my automated testing? Well, I can leverage open source to help drive that very, very quickly. There's a whole market out there of people who might know Selenium, for example, that I can hire and help to drive that automation. It's becoming very apparent to lots of profitable organizations that they have that ability to measure that risk versus the reward, and many of them are choosing the reward. I'd rather be in a position that I can facilitate a level of testing where there's a known market for it. It's available from a source code perspective, and I can have a better understanding of what I'm using and then potentially build on top of that.
Fair.
Yeah, and just to add to what Adam was saying, I do think that open source technologies are an incredible foundation. They're incredibly useful when it comes to testing, and even for companies like Tricentis, like our own company. I don't think we would be able to offer the automation technologies that we can offer today if those open source technologies hadn't come first. A lot of the times what we are doing is just simplifying the process. Creating open source automation comes with its own set of challenges. It's something that can be very time consuming. It's something that requires quite a bit of expertise and knowledge. Sometimes being able to find the users that will be able to create that automation for us is a big challenge as well. So Tricentis is simply simplifying those processes and making it more accessible to a broader amount of people. But when it comes to the open source technologies themselves, I think they're going to continue to be a basis for testing on automation well into the future. But we'll just continue to build systems on top of them that will simplify and make it more accessible for the end user to be able to contribute to the automation efforts, getting us closer to DevOps in that agile world, which right now does come with a lot of, I would say, skill set challenges and some maintenance challenges as well.
Anybody else thoughts on that?
Yes. So I would actually love to hear more from Adam about what you understand as risk. But to me, my understanding of open source, especially for if you think about collective benefit, and in that, within software where testing and security would be main points, where you can, of course, have business. So I think it's important when we differentiate the idea of openness and benefits of the collective and collaborative work with the idea of free and mean no money involved, right? There are several possibilities for us to foster new types of market. I think it is a challenge for the business perspective, for sure. Got to be more inventive and creative. But if you think about the tool chain and the testing environment as something that needs this potential of the collectiveness, I'm not entirely sure if I understand the idea of risk. And then I would like to hear your thoughts on that. I would love to. But I agree with Alan that it is one of these possibilities of marketing and how to introduce business into open source. That's one of the possibilities, just like Andres was quoting, right? You either make it more easier for the user, or you add some value, like data analysis or insights report or something where you will have specifically wins for your client that only a company with really devoted people, well paid for do that, can give you as a benefit. I believe so.
Yeah,
Adam?
Regarding risk, I mean, it comes down to FUD, which, basically fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? And so organizations that I've seen, certainly enterprise level organizations, when we step back 10 or more years, we're looking at open source with that, from that perspective, saying, how could this piece of software possibly, how could I possibly bring it into my inner workings and incorporate it sort of day to day, and how would that end up functioning? And there was just too many questions about it. And over time, as we've learned and we've seen, open source fundamentally has better quality. It has fewer bugs. It's got much better testing overall. And it comes back down to the simple fact that as we've sort of gone through the hype curve, a lot of open source that we have found that's in that plateau of productivity area has so many people working on it fundamentally that it would be better than any piece of code that you're going to write in-house, right? And when you begin to look at it from that lens and that perspective, it all of a sudden doesn't become fear. All the uncertainty goes away and the doubt begins to dwindle, and these enterprise organizations say, okay, I get it. Let's begin to use that and follow that industry trend.
So if anything, open source lowers the risk, I think, is the point you're making there. When it's become a standard like that.
Certainly, yeah.
Alan, just kind of jumping in, just thinking about the progression. I remember working with dev teams, test teams, and like, we need a test framework, we need a test harness. That's where things like Selenium came from, is to give you sort of a way of hanging all your tests together and executing them in some sensible way and managing the data. But if you look at the kind of market, I think one of the reasons why there's sort of natural silos is because testing tools, whether commercial or open source, pop up for software architectures. Let's test service mesh. Let's test microservices. Here's some specialized tools to do that. Or technologies. This is the Java environment. This is JMeter. This is Appian for mobile. This is Canary testing. And then there's also applications. Here's ServiceNow. Here's whatever, SAP and Salesforce. And so it's kind of not only a silo, but a complex bevy of tools. And there's, of course, I didn't even mention SAST and DAST and all the different kinds of testing that we can do. It is a bit confusing, and it is a challenge to know not just what to automate. This is the point of all this. It's not just automating it, but it's what do we do? And then of that, what do we automate? So we spend time working on the right things and don't waste our time on stuff that's not going to help us, make better software.
And I'm glad you bring that up, Mitch, because we do see some primary reasons why those silos get created with the customers that we work with. One of them being what you just mentioned, the variety of technologies that are out there, not only that need to be tested, but also the amount of frameworks and technologies that we can use to test. Even for one technology, there can be 3 or 4 choices of frameworks that we could use to test that technology. And it comes down a lot of times to a matter of preference, resources, how those teams operate. But regardless, in a single organization, sometimes you will have several teams that are doing testing, each one with their own tool set, each one with their own schedules. And at that point, it becomes very hard to start sharing that information unless there is a system in place that can do that for you. Likewise, those different teams might be even operating very differently. We sometimes find that within the organization, there's one team that might be super advanced. They're full DevOps. They're executing through a CI/CD pipeline. Most of their stuff is automated. They're very lean. But then we also have other teams within the same organization who are still, testing with spreadsheets in a very manual way. And sometimes it really just comes down to the nature of the process. And not everyone's going to move at the same speed, which again creates even more silos because all those teams are operating much differently. And even when it comes down to executing those tests, now you have to figure out a way of how do I combine the results of my manual testers and the results of my automation that maybe is running through a CI/CD pipeline. Because unless I'm looking at everything, I'm not going to have a full picture, right? I'm only going to get automation results at one point. I'm only going to get manual results at another. And then I'm going to have a logistical nightmare of how do I visualize this to truly be able to answer the important questions, right? Is my product ready? Can I release? Is there low risk? Am I going to get fired if I promote this code? So I think that we see that all across the industry when talking to customers. And to me, those tend to be the primary reasons why those silos get created and those teams tend to not work as well together.
Yeah, just going off that, I think one of the things that we mentioned earlier too was that it's like QA and testers are not the gatekeepers of products and of the code that goes out. And so a lot of times what we see is that when something goes wrong, you blame QA or you blame the testers of oh, why wasn't this caught or why wasn't this fixed? Oh, let's it was QA's fault. But I think what's going to happen more and more often is that the testing is going to be distributed to developers and testers and across the team, so that the entire team will own the quality of the product as opposed to just the QA team. And I think that goes with what we were all saying about the testing that the QA person does isn't the only testing that happens. It happens across the entire team.
So I think that is a big DevOps thing right there, right? That testing isn't just for testers. And I think open source tools have accelerated that. But I also think companies who have built testing tools on top of open source testing platforms have accelerated that as well.
Yeah,
right?
And an example of that, I previously at one of the companies I worked for, when I was a tester, I used Cucumber and Gherkin together, and just a regular BDD framework. And for those of you who haven't used Cucumber and Gherkin, it's a very straightforward language where you write like given when then code, and you don't necessarily have to have a lot of programming experience to be able to write tests. And that's what I love about some of these open source frameworks, is that you don't have to have, you know, years and years of coding experience to be able to understand and write tests. You can learn how to write tests through these frameworks without having a ton of coding experience. And so that's one of the reasons that I liked using specifically Robot Framework with Cucumber, because I was able to, you know, as a new grad from college, I was able to just immediately go in and be able to write tests without having, you know, going through a ton of, you know, coding onboarding.
Well, in part of what both Talia and Andres, I think, head on to what you're saying there too, in Mitch, that to help try to answer that question about the silos, I think comes back to a DevOps team providing or driving consistency in building out a platform which contains both processes, but as well as tools. So instead of having a sort of a free-for-all, what the DevOps team has to do in that case is assert and lay out and say, well, here are the tools for the kinds of testing that you need to do using this platform through this process. Move forward and go ahead and use it. And if there's a gap, identify that gap and then work with the different product teams to try to fill that gap. Otherwise, you'll continue to just have those silos forever and ever and ever.
Yeah, and I think, like, at the end of the day, like, if it's not easy to write tests, like, no one's going to do them. Like, whether it's unit tests or integration tests or end-to-end tests, like, if it's not easy to write tests, no one's going to do them. So, or they're going to, you know, give you a hard time about writing them.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
This is actually one question that we always ask ourselves, and I think at some point, and I will actually really appreciate to hear your thoughts on that. That is actually that, like, how do you make testing part of your workflow without thinking, oh no, I have to do the testing now? And I really appreciate what Talia said, how you approach the testing on, okay, so simplify the thing, look through where will the product break, and what is actually people using it. That is such a beautiful thinking, right, about how to approach it. But then you go to the white canvas. You're there and you have to actually create the suit. And as Andres was saying, like you have to do that suit in a way that you can analyze with all the organization. How do you make that useful? And you're not writing tests for the sake of testing. And I do not have a magic wand, but I believe that this is where also the idea of open source and especially open standards come in handy. Because if you approach open source and open frameworks from the approach of having a standard that works for everyone, we have the possibility to have this frameworks that like a Legos can connect together, and you can start to have something more integrated.
I think that just goes back to, like, every team's definition of done. Like, a feature shouldn't be considered done until all the tests are written for it. And that's something that worked really well when I was a tester, is that until the tests are checked in and they're running in production and, you know, everything is working smoothly and the tests have completed, like, then if that hasn't happened, the feature's not done. So that's something that worked really well for me.
Absolutely. You know, it goes back to something I said at the top of the show, which is, are we a victim of our own success? Do we have an embarrassment of riches, right? So Talia mentioned, for instance, Cucumber Gherkin, two very popular, Gherkin kind of is with Cucumber, but two very popular tools in the open source testing space. Someone, Mitch, I think, mentioned Selenium, I might have. How is a team to choose the right tool for the job? And even if they have a strong bias and preference for open source, right? How did they choose? Adam, you have an organization that I think you said it 15,000 developers or something like that. How do you choose among all the great options that are out there?
Yeah. So in that way, we have to be very cognizant of what our engineers' needs are, right, and satisfy 80% of them, right, and so in that way, we have to be able to provide objective information that will lay out how we'll meet with those needs. Like I said, of 80% of the organization, and from there, then provide consistency in how those different tools are laid out, and then how they should be used. And that's a major part of our role in our organization. But it also comes back to the process aspect of it too. So there's processes that we have in place which are there deliberately so that when we are building a product, we go through several phases of testing before we get to that end state, and those are very, very fast cycles as we go through them. But we might have different tools for different stages depending on the different kinds of testing that we're doing. But we have to come to that conclusion together as a single organization. It sounds challenging, but in all honesty, to be able to provide that ecosystem just simply takes time. It just takes time. It's not that the tools aren't there; they are. But it also comes back to there's this notion of what I need versus what I like, right? And so what you like versus what you need are two different things. And so we have to differentiate those things and provide what the organization needs versus what some people like versus what other people like. I mean, it comes back to the age-old IDE conversation. Well, I really like VI versus Emacs versus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what do you really need, and what could everybody use successfully, right? Similar kinds of conversation here.
Agreed. Tali, you have real world experience testing, right? You mentioned you used to enjoy Cucumber Gherkin, just putting it in there. How did you choose? What were the right tools for the job?
It was a combination of things. One of the things that was important to us is that we needed to be able to test in production, and that's something that I stand by, is being able to run your tests in production. And so with these tools, we were able to integrate them with GCP and with all of our other tools that we were using. So like integrations is another reason to use a specific tool, because does it integrate with the other tools that your teams are using? That's a big point. And then again, it's just like the ease of use. Like Cucumber, Gherkin, and Robot Framework were so easy to use. Like I could write tests and have them checked in minutes. Like it was so easy. And it just made the processes, the testing processes and the development processes just so much faster and so much more seamless because they were so easy to write. And so, yeah, I'm a huge fan of Robot Framework and Cucumber.
Absolutely. One of the participants in our audience suggested a couple of others, Karate, ALM, OC. I mean, look, as I said, there's no shortage of great tools, open source testing tools out there. Guys, we only have a few minutes left. For our audience out here who's grappling what to do, right? I'm going to ask each of you just like parting words, your best advice for people in terms of, look, just because you're a fan of open source testing doesn't mean everything you do has to be based on it either, too, right? But I'm going to ask each of you to give your kind of best last words of advice to the audience. Before we do, though, I wanted to mention, we always give out 4 Amazon gift cards at these events, and we picked some winners this event. We have Laura, I hope I get this right. Lauren C, it looks like Varia G, Bernardo M, and Ned K. I hope I got those right. Our team will reach out and get you your Amazon gift cards for those. So best advice for people. Andreas, I had asked you to kick things off, so I'm going to let you go last, so you have time to talk. Paloma, if it's not too much to ask, would you mind going first?
Oh, sure. I believe if you're just putting your feet there and starting with trying to create reliable software, I would start with definitely an open source tool. That it is not just because it's my passion, it's because I think you will find through documentation and support for that. But also, you can start with tools that will you should start trying out. Just download, just try it out. I really like to mostly use natural processing languages, so they are easier to really write. Those are easier for the heart. So searching for tools that have good documentation, either I would change that phrase, either open source or not, but if they have good support and documentation, you will feel more supported to start your journey on it. If you have some chance to be part of the community somehow or contribute to, you can understand deeply the tool, it's even more interesting, because then you can just make the best of it. I think that would be my advice. Look for tools that has great support and documentation.
Excellent. Adam, how about you?
So in my opinion, it's all about consistency, standardization, and using the right set of tools for the right job. In all honesty, that's how you're going to scale. That's how you're going to solve the several hundred different product group problem that you may have, and so it's about building that ecosystem that your developers can thrive in and be productive in, but having that scoped productive set of tools, which are the right tools, in delivering them and having your engineers use them in a consistent way. That's absolutely key.
I think that's great advice. Talia, how about you?
Final words, I would say use tools that are easy to use, and QA and testers they shouldn't be bottlenecks, and they shouldn't be solely responsible for the quality of what you're releasing. It's the entire team owns product quality.
I agree with you. The entire team, not just the test team, the entire team, including security, owns product quality. Excellent last words. Andreas, how about yourself?
Yeah, just from slightly different perspective, I think like Adam was saying, when you're considering open source automation and open source testing tools, you're considering scaling up. You likely have hit a bottleneck somewhere where adding more manpower is simply just not efficient anymore. And we have to look for the help of digital tools to really get us there. And to do that, we really also want to consider how we're going to manage that process. It's a process that can get quite complex very fast. And we're already trying to scale up our business. So we need to consider how we're going to scale up that automation, how we're going to streamline it, how we're going to offer it to other teams. And if it's successful, how do we keep that organized and growing steadily, as by its nature, it will always be growing. So when adopting open source frameworks, I do think it's very important that you keep in mind how you're going to manage that framework and how you're going to scale it and extend it to the rest of your organization.
Excellent. Good stuff. Mitchell, as always, I was going to give you the last word.
Thank you. I got kicked off there, back on. Well, the parts I heard were just fantastic. I love this team and this panel. You know, one of the things I think about is the same thing I think about when we talk about writing software as we talk about writing tests. And there are two people I got to count in my best developer category. And one characteristic they both tell me is the best developer are the laziest developers. They like to write the least amount of code because they reuse stuff, right? And so I think the same applies in a test world, right? You can get yourself in that corner, back yourself in a corner where now maintaining all these tests is a Herculean task. And I think that's a lot of where some of the tools like what Tali was talking about, you know, using a lighter weight approach for a scripting language that makes it easier to not only use, but maintain. And so when you think about testing holistically, that's another important aspect I would suggest considering in addition to the great advice everybody else had.
Excellent. Well, panel, thank you so much for a great discussion today. We really did have a panel of experts on here. We're going to wrap up this edition of DevOps Unbound Roundtable. We'll be back on, and not next week, the week after, with another great episode. But until then, this is Alan Schimmel for Techstrong. Many thanks to Tricentis for sponsoring, and thank you for watching. And if you're watching this on demand, because you know these are available on demand on YouTube and through DevOps.com. I'm sorry you weren't able to participate live with our audience, but we hope you get as much out of it. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.